This presentation is based on a workbook for arguments, 3rd edition, by David Morrow and Anthony Weston. We're going to look at Rule 30, which is about how to spell out basic ideas as arguments when you're exploring an issue. A basic argument is a short argument, typically one or a small number of inferences, a small number of logical steps, and therefore it has a small number of premises. Oftentimes, basic arguments just make premises as basic assumptions, and they don't defend them with arguments of their own. Or they may have two or a small number of logical steps where a couple of premises are partially defended. So we're in the topic of exploring an issue. We've identified the specific issue, such as what should the U.S. immigration policy be? We've outlined the important positions on that issue, such as the U.S. should have open borders. The U.S. should permit no legal immigration. The U.S. should prioritize skilled labor immigration, etc. For each of those positions, it's good to explore one or more basic arguments. The idea of the basic argument is it's an idea for an argument that you may need to flesh out more in a later step. So here's an example of a basic argument related to the issue of what should the U.S. immigration policy be. U.S. agriculture depends on undocumented immigrant labor. Therefore, undocumented immigrants make an important contribution to the U.S. economy. Therefore, the U.S. should give legal amnesty to undocumented immigrants. So this argument has been placed in what's called standard form in logic. This is where we number the premises and the conclusion. We put the conclusion last after the premises. And optionally, you can include premise indicators for each of your logical moves or inferences. You'll notice in step 2 of this argument, the number 1 is in parentheses after that statement. That shows you that that step, that line of the argument, is derived logically from line 1. And you can also see with step 3 of the argument that it's derived from line 2. You also, for standard form, should use the word therefore to indicate a conclusion or an inference. The last step or line of the argument is going to be the main conclusion of the argument. If therefore occurs on a previous line, that means that is a sub-conclusion, a premise that is itself proven, but which then goes on to prove the main conclusion at the bottom. So the general rule when sketching out basic arguments, and this is regardless of whether you think that the position is any good, regardless of whether you think this particular idea for an argument is any good, when you're exploring the issue, it's good to explore positions and arguments you may not agree with. However, even in those cases, you want to have the argument make a kind of sense. It should be a sort of argument that someone who believes in that position could take seriously, and that a prospective audience for the argument could take seriously. So a general rule for making arguments effective is that the premises should be more plausible, more obvious, or more widely believed than the conclusion. That has to do with the function of arguments. A logical argument is supposed to take you from things you assume to be true already, the premises, to something you don't yet believe, the conclusion. Now this is only going to work if the premises are more plausible or more obvious than the conclusion. So let's look at an example of the argument that violates this principle. 1. No government should place any kind of legal restriction on people's travel or immigration to the country. 2. Therefore, the U.S. should give legal amnesty to undocumented immigrants. Now this is actually potentially a valid or a logical argument, an argument that makes sense. Because if that premise is true, it would give you a reason for believing the conclusion. The problem is that the premise is very strong, very extreme. And so the premise actually is going to be harder to prove, harder to get people to believe. It's going to be less plausible, at least at first glance, prima facie, than the conclusion. So it reverses the order of logical justification. The order of logical justification is that we should start with premises that are more obvious and then try to move to a conclusion that may be less initially obvious. So here's an example of an argument that does that, the argument we were looking at before. U.S. agriculture depends on undocumented labor. Therefore, undocumented immigrants make an important contribution to the economy. Therefore, the U.S. should give legal amnesty to undocumented immigrants. That conclusion may not be believed by someone who does believe the premises. They just hadn't really thought about what the logical implication of those premises are. It's also critical to distinguish between different arguments for the same conclusion. It's common in arguments that appear in ordinary language, whether written or spoken, to jumble together different justifications for the same conclusion. However, when we're doing issue analysis, we're looking at an issue systematically. We're looking at arguments for all the various positions on that issue. We need to be able to untangle different arguments for the same position. The main reason for this is because even if one of those arguments fails, the other argument could be successful. So if we jumble those arguments together, we're not going to notice the differences, the logical differences between those two arguments. So here's an example. The U.S. should give legal amnesty to undocumented immigrants because agriculture depends on undocumented immigrant labor, and it would increase the amount of income taxes paid to the federal government. These are actually two different reasons that are logically separate that are being given for that position. So we want to make a separate argument for each of those reasons. One is the agriculture argument. The second we could call the taxes argument. The taxes argument is something like this. Giving legal amnesty to undocumented immigrants makes it easier to tax their income. Therefore, giving legal amnesty to undocumented immigrants increases the amount of income taxes paid to the federal government. Therefore, the U.S. should give legal amnesty to undocumented immigrants. And that's a logically separate argument from the agriculture argument. So one of those arguments could succeed even if the other fails, and vice versa. So these are some of the ways we can develop our ideas for basic arguments. One, to identify suppressed or unstated premises. The arguments that I just gave you as examples actually are not logically valid, but you can make them valid somewhat easily just by adding additional premises. It's very common for arguments that occur in ordinary language contexts, whether spoken or written, to leave out essential premises. And this is often done just for the sake of avoiding stating the obvious, to make the argument briefer, more to the point, more impactful. Typically, it could be that the audience can fill in the logical gaps themselves. So an example is the agriculture argument. It's actually invalid as stated. To make it valid, though, we could add a couple premises that are not stated. We'll get back to that in a second. A second way of developing the basic argument is to explain premises that require clarification. So this could be different types of background information you need to understand what the premise is about, or it could include definitions. Let's look at premise one of this agriculture argument. U.S. agriculture depends on undocumented immigrant labor. Look at the phrase depends on. What does that mean? That's pretty vague as stated. So in order to develop this basic argument, you would want to define or explain what you mean by depends on here in more detail. A similar issue exists for the second premise in that argument. Therefore, undocumented immigrants make an important contribution to the economy. What do you mean by important contribution? You want to define that more precisely so it's empirically verifiable. You can test it against evidence you can gather. A third way of developing a basic argument is to defend some of the premises with arguments of their own. If you have a premise that supports your conclusion, but if the premise is itself controversial or maybe questioned by people who don't yet believe the conclusion, it's generally a good idea to defend that premise with an argument. So we'll come back to this idea of developing an argument in more detail when we look at Rule 31. So let's return to this idea of a suppressed premise. A suppressed premise is a premise that's not explicitly stated, but which an argument seems to implicitly assume, because you have to assume it to make the argument valid. Now, sometimes the person making the argument may not even realize that they have to make this assumption. Or they may have realized that the assumption is necessary, but they didn't state it just for purposes of abbreviation. However, when we're systematically evaluating the argument, we want to include all of those premises for two reasons. One, we want to make sure that the argument can be put forward in its strongest form. Oftentimes, if you have a suppressed premise, leaving out that premise makes the argument invalid. And you could say, oh, we should reject this argument because it's invalid. There's a logical gap. But if you could easily make the argument valid just by adding a premise, you should do so. But that leads to the second reason for identifying suppressed premises, because sometimes the premise that's left out could itself be controversial. It could be false or unreliable, and so we want to identify what the argument needs to assume to make the conclusion follow, because we may want to attack one of those suppressed premises. The term for an argument that leaves out one or more premises in this way is called an enthymeme. So here's an example. The argument that we previously looked at, the agriculture argument, has suppressed premises because it's missing some things you need to add to make it valid. U.S. agriculture depends on undocumented immigrant labor. In order to prove undocumented immigrants make an important contribution of the U.S. economy, in order to make that a valid inference, you need to add at least one more premise. If U.S. agriculture depends on undocumented labor, then undocumented immigrants make an important contribution of the U.S. economy. Similarly, we have to add another premise here, line 4, to validly deduce the conclusion, here, line 5. If undocumented immigrants make an important contribution, then the U.S. should give legal amnesty to them. And you'll notice each of these premises we've added, while they do make the argument logically valid, they actually fill the logical gap that previously existed in the argument. They are new assumptions that may themselves require justification.